You're listening to The Back 40, the podcast for Ontario farmers, covering topics and issues that matter most to Ontario agriculture. Brought to you by Trillium Mutual Insurance, bringing the ag community together one podcast at a time. I'm the host of The Back 40, Mike Brine, agribusiness specialist at Trillium Mutual Insurance. The idea of where our food comes from is becoming one that is more popular with consumers these days. People want to know who grew their food and how it was produced, and that involves traceability. We've been involved in the idea of traceability in the crop industry for quite a few years. We've been growing IP beans in Ontario for well over 25 years, and a premium involved in that. But that traceability has sometimes been a little bit of an issue as to how we determine where everything comes from. One company that is trying to solve that is a company called Grain Discovery. And we're here today with Rory O'Sullivan, who is the founder and CEO of Grain Discovery. Rory, welcome to the Back 40.
Thank you very much. And that is an Australian accent, so I apologize in advance.
There'll be people that say that you don't have the accent, I've got the accent. So it's all about your perspective, isn't it? So what is Grain Discovery and what are you doing about traceability in the agricultural industry?
The original concept of the company, and so the company is nearly 3.5 years old, was kind of how can we digitize the supply chain, the grain supply chain, the bulk commodity supply chain. And we really thought, obviously, with tech innovation happening in the industry, especially in the grains industry, we thought it was the perfect timing to really dedicate ourselves to this kind of company, especially from a startup perspective, like Grain Discovery is. You can be too early or too late. But we thought it was the ideal timing. Grain Discovery is looking to digitize the entire supply chain from seed to the end consumer. Ambitious, as I said. And so our first kind of beachhead product was actually, how can we first just digitize the handshake? How can we digitize the price discovery, the contract execution between a farmer and his kind of local grain buyer? And so that's what we've kind of launched late last year here in Ontario. And that's kind of like white labeled, like a personally branded app in the App Store, and they onboard their farmers. So the farmer can download Mike Elevator's app and they can see, all their portfolio, regard to their contracts, all their delivery tickets, settlements, and also see live bids that the elevator kind of posts. And so like a really kind of digitized way to really kind of streamline that execution of that actually grain contract. So think about, stock trading as it was 15, 20 years ago. It was very much expensive. It was a lot of paper, shuffling. And now, we can trade stocks, like on our app. That was, thinking how can we really streamline that paper shuffling process, which some aspects have remained unchanged when our grandparents were farming. And as we've digitized that contract execution, now we can slowly look to digitize and record other information that relates to that contract. And obviously for traceability, the first kind of step is just capturing that very basic agronomic details that have been recorded. IP beans, obviously Ontario is famous for that crop. That was that low-hanging fruit in regard to what are the first crops to digitize.
So that makes a lot of this data available to everybody that is within that particular supply chain that we're talking about there, so that the information that the farmer has about the contract or the buyer has about the contract is easily accessible to everybody there. I'm assuming that this app that you're talking about with the digitizing, that's a great opportunity to have a look and say, okay, I've got 5,000 bushels and I like that price, bang, I can sell that right there.
Yep, exactly. He can execute a contract straight away, which I believe is the first time this functionality has been developed in North America. But also he can create a target off in regard to, hey, price is $12. I want to sell it $13. And once the market hits that, then that contract's automatically kind of executed. But more importantly, especially from my background, working in the grain supply chain, generally it helps to, especially busy times of the year, you kind of have the same conversation 30 times a day. It doesn't obviously take away that aspect of a farmer calling the elevator, because you don't want to remove that. But what it does eliminate is that 5 minutes of every conversation when you have to update the farmer what his portfolio is, how much is sold, how much is delivered, how much he can hedge. And now the farmer has got that information on his app, and then he can really cut right to the chase in regard to more strategic conversations in regard to what's my marketing plan. So really kind of cut down on those more mundane aspects of the job.
I have to admit that I was one of those that first call I'd make was, so how much have I got contracted? And then we finally get to what's the price for today and how much can I do and that sort of thing. That if it had all been available in that one spot, that would have been an easy conversation to start with. I see the price is, let's do something about that. One of the other things you talk about the IP beans, and I remember when I was growing those, there was paperwork, there were seed tags to keep track of, there was a whole lot of the hoops that you had to go through. Digitizing that keeps that all in one place as well. Am I correct?
Yeah, correct. Obviously, as I said, we are dealing in a bulk commodity, and people, when they think about traceability in the grains industry, they go, well, how do you do that when there could be 40 or 50 farmers in this bin? And that's why, look at this technology. Okay, what's that low-hanging fruit? What are those crops that have those legacy traceability attributes in place? And IP beans is the exact kind of perfect use case. Not only are farmers already trained in filling out this paperwork, but there is that origin story attached to it. So that was like that ideal commodity digitized first rather than yellow corn or spring wheat.
And we've already figured out how to keep the product itself separate. When we go to sell that, now we've got that electronic record that we can point the elevator or the buyer of it.
And it's a good template also for us to use for other commodities that want to embrace traceability. There's many layers of what traceability kind of is. Obviously IP is back to the variety, back to individual farmer. But then for those more kind of bulk crops, you can target or market it for a certain geographic kind of region. Maybe it's a bit far-fetched, but I always use the wine analogy. The Barossa Valley, the Chardonnay, Bordeaux regions are generally not branded to the winery. Well, they are to an extent, but the more powerful branding is from that geographic region. And hey, grain's growing in the ground, wine's growing in the ground. Why can't we use that same analogy to brand it? Yes, we're based in Prince Edward County here in Eastern Ontario. Why can't there be a premium around Prince Edward County grain? There's a great marketing opportunity with that. And obviously that's one of the benefits of traceability, not only verifying that supply chain, but also once you've got this standardized data, then you can create very powerful branding tools around that. If I can use a famous Canadian term, definitely that's where the puck's going in regard to going away from that pure commodity industry to an ingredients industry where consumers demand distinction. And that's exactly what that IP supply chain is. And that probably still is the gold standard in the world.
There's very few areas in the world that have the infrastructure to be able to keep the varieties separate. The states, they have the capability of growing the crop, but the idea of being able to keep that separate once they cut into an elevator, it just doesn't happen. And even taking it a little bit further, we go back a few years ago, we had a lot of problems with mold and toxins in the corn. And particularly in my area, it was really bad. We had corn here that was very high. It was certainly unfit for livestock feed. And yet there'd be other areas within Ontario where they didn't have that same problem. There's a spot where that traceability becomes very important because the livestock farmers need something that's clean. So you've carried this on for more than just through IP beans and the idea of the commodities there. You've actually had a working model of this outside of that. And it's a commodity that's probably near and dear to a lot of us, craft beer. Tell us about that.
Our partners of ours, and that's with Canadian Seed Growers Association and with Olds College. So that's the Smart Farm just north of Calgary. And that's a perfect use case of a bulk commodity. Malt barley is still a bulk commodity, but there is a premium with malt. Well, most of the years there's a premium. In drought years, not so much. That was the perfect use case of not only the ability to do some of the IP logic around barley, but more importantly, that was that overwhelming end consumer demand for traceability. You think about why does craft beer exist? It is that more that local artisanal flavor aspect. And there's already a large premium. Yeah, so that was the perfect kind of a use case with the barley supply chain. And it's also interesting for barley, unlike kind of, I suppose, IP soy varieties, that the barley industry is still, especially in Western Canada, is still kind of dominated by two main varieties, and they're like 20 years old. And that's the thing about traceability in this kind of project is also how can we bring the industry together, for the common good. And obviously for traceability, everyone stands to gain apart from those bad actors. At least the seed industry, for them, is how can we really build a stronger business case for not only purchasing kind of certified seed, but also a use case where we can help to promote new varieties of barley, especially for us going forward. We hope to hopefully, knock on wood, receive more funding from the barley industry. But how can we associate craft beer with malt barley? Because currently now drinkers associate craft beer with hops, because that's obviously more the stronger flavor profile. But there was strong interest to want to know where, what that farmer's origin story is. Yeah. And so we want to really associate that varietal selection. And, yes, there is a weaker flavor profile, but actually some colleagues of ours in Saskatchewan, they're doing a trial with, does different varieties really impact on that flavor profile? And that's kind of why craft brewery industry are more willing to try new varieties and so forth. There was a strong willingness from the consumer that they want this information, in regard to scanning a QR code on that can and, understanding and also being educated on the supply chain, but also, from the brewery, the grower, the seed industry, and also from the Canadian industry, in regard to how can I remain competitive.
It's premium product that you're buying when you buy craft beer. It's not like just going into the local brewers retail and saying, hey, give me 6 of whatever. This is a unique thing there, and it has a story behind it. And people are interested in, first, the flavor, of course, but also what's the story behind this? And that certainly should drive a little bit of profitability. People should be willing to pay a little bit more for the idea of not only is it a great product, but I can tell the story behind it as well.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of that digital passport, I call it, that's the cherry on the top that the consumer can engage with. The real value prop for the supply chain is just those efficiencies gained when this kind of manual paper-based system is now digitized, but also, the ability where this kind of digital ecosystem where third-party data and ERP systems can link in. So, there's not double entry of information. Something can be verified kind of straight away in regard to, those seed tag numbers. Then, that can ping the Canadian seed grower database straight away and go, yep, this has been certified, exactly. So there's a lot of efficiencies gained in that supply chain. But then, as I said, at the end, you've got the standardized data. Then that end, that secondary processor, which is the brewer in this case, can then, create this really cool origin marketing story where they can differentiate their product from their competitors and also, educate their consumers, which I think is a very powerful thing. I actually use an example. I went tapping maple trees for the first time. You realize there's a lot of work going into this, in regard to freezing, collecting this sap, potentially breaking an ankle and stepping over, hidden crevices in the limestone and that whole kind of boiled down process, which I forget. But now that I was educated about that, you think, wow, this is actually a premium product and it's pretty cheap when you think about it, maple syrup. And so I like to use that in regard to if someone now, can see that digital passport, can see, yes, this is a premium product, but here's this journey that potentially started, 2 years ago from that certified seed. Then, they go, hey, this isn't factory produced. It's a detailed checks and balances have been made. And then hopefully, there is that an additional premium attached to that.
And this is technology that's going to go throughout the industry in different commodities, where people will come to the store and they'll look at a product that's been produced and they'll see a QR code there and they'll scan the QR code. And this is the technology that will tell them all that traceability. Where did all of the products that made that final end use product, where'd they all come from?
And then maybe in the future, you just may need to show this information to access certain premium kind of markets.
I mean, IP beans are a really good example for that. You say it's the gold standard, but there's a market out there that's willing to pay for these beans. If you can guarantee what the variety is, anywhere from wanting non-GMO beans to companies that want clear Highland beans, there's lots of people out there that are willing to pay for these premium products. It's just a question of how do we prove that this is what we say it is? Do you like what you're hearing from the Back 40? We'd like to hear from you. Send us an email with your comments and thoughts to theback40@trilliummutual.com or follow us on social media @Trillium Mutual. There's been a lot of talk about data and who owns the data and farmers sharing their data and then finding out that somebody's like, well, no, that actually belongs to the company that collected it. It no longer belongs to you. Is there any pushback from any of the producers along the line here with sharing their information?
That's a very hot topic of data and who's mining that data and who is benefiting from it. And again, the great thing about IP is, well, at least, the version 1 of like digitizing a current paper-based ad hoc system is, okay, let's not create new data that needs to be captured. Let's just focus on the current data that you currently write down. And it's fairly basic: field boundaries, what was applied, crop inputs, cleaning schedule, trucking, and so forth. If I kind of can steer the conversation to based on like the grain discovery kind of tech stack, and that's what we think is going to be a game changer in regard to data sharing and who has access to that data and depending on your permissions. Envision a supply chain, with its operating with all the legacy systems that exist currently, but operating as like a common kind of a database, that all participants can access, they can read, and they can write to. Open source computing platform that really provides consensus, giving the supply chain, really for the first time, a single version of the truth. This is kind of blockchain. Blockchain really boiled down is just an online kind of ledger for record keeping and data sharing. And you retain ownership of your data and you elect to share it when it's beneficial to do so. Obviously, people think about blockchain and think about open public blockchain. So think Bitcoin, where every single transaction has been recorded since the dawn of time. But this is private permission blockchain. So that is every role is determined on who you are. So every user is identified, they're verified, and they receive access to data according to their defined permissions. So this enables all parties to work off the same system whilst maintaining that privacy when it's kind of needed. So for example, not everyone on the supply chain, for the end consumer, they don't really want to see the purchase or sale price, for example. They just want to see from that particular farmer or that particular geographic kind of region. Or for instance, an auditor or a crop inspector, well, then they can see more into that supply chain, depending on their role in that supply chain. That's what we think can help kind of streamline that data flow and that standardization. But it's also, going forward, as I said, we're just focusing on what's currently recorded now. But since, we're integrating with other third-party systems, now you can offer a greater array of information to that main consumer or that processor. And that could be more sustainability metrics that are recorded directly from the tractor cabin or soil types from probes that you have that can link in directly. That's kind of the exciting thing where this information can be shared more easily. And then obviously there's a compensation like benefit from that.
It's all about adding value into the supply chain as to who can use that data. And if the data exists and you can get access to it, sometimes that can mean quite a windfall for you as a processor or a seller of that product. If you can say, hey, that came from here, or this is how this was produced, or this had only this fertilizer on it. That's information. You don't have to share that, but if it makes you money, that's a good place where you can share. And the advantage of that common database, of course, is you enter the information once and not, I entered it here for me and here for the bank and here for my buyers. It's entered once, we're done. That's it. What's the reception been like from different parts of the supply chain, particularly farmers? I know that some farmers are always into that next technical advance and others are like, oh, not another thing on a computer, not another thing on my phone. What's the reception been generally like?
From a farmer's perspective, it's not reinventing the wheel. It's just filling out the same information you do, but in a digital format, far more easily on your computer or on your app. And then, as I mentioned before, a lot of these processes aren't duplicated. It does streamline a lot of that current paperwork. So yeah, it's a huge win. And also for the primary processors who are our initial paying customers, obviously it does streamline a lot of that paperwork for contracts, but also especially for auditing. That's a common thing we get, for audits. Sometimes it's a couple of people in their boardroom for a day or two going through these big, thick binders and, doing that manual paper audit trail themselves. And this is, like entering a lot number, bang, here it is. That ROI is just time and cost savings. That's what gets people involved. Yeah, show me my ROI and then hopefully, it'll be like a no-brainer.
Yeah, from a producer standpoint, I mean, that traceability and those audits and all that costs money. And you want to sell it, you've got to be able to prove what you've got is you say you've got. You can just pull up an electronic file and they say, okay, it's this lot. And it's like, okay, here's the farmers that produced that. Here's the seed numbers. Here's the traceability. It's all one spot and they don't have to go digging through my folder that's got my receipt for my seed and all of my seed tags and that sort of stuff. I don't have to go back that far.
As you mentioned, we've done some pilots in the past, but they've been really, a lot of it's been backdated information. It's been, capturing one segment of the supply chain. So we're kind of excited for next year's kind of growing season. This information will be recorded throughout that growing season. At the conclusion, we'll have a great ROI. What is the value prop that we can really use that as that great marketing tool to onboard more clients? So we're excited about that for sure.
Where do you see this going in the future? Like you're talking next year, that's short term, 3, 4, 5, 10 years out the road. Where are we looking? Are we looking at tracing just about everything that comes off the farm, or is that still something that is not there yet?
Yeah, great question. Obviously, people can see the use case for, I suppose I call them more niche crops. If I look at corn as an example, IP beans is still a niche crop, yeah. Food grade, pulses, lentils, that's the human consumption thing. But, as I said, traceability has many different layers. It will be impossible. You would have to, it's funny, like before the war, the supply chain was more built for IP. If you can, recall, each of the Hessian sacks were individually sewn up on the field, loaded,
Yep.
like at the elevator and shipped in sacks. And then, after the bulk commoditization occurred after the war, we did lose that aspect of it. And the supply chain now, especially in an export-oriented country like Canada, the supply chain is just ship it out as quick as we can. And so obviously the whole industry will have to have tremendous amount of infrastructure changes to get that more of that IP traceability. But you think about like all that like on-farm storage built over the past 15 years. It's been tremendous. So there is a great opportunity for that. But like I mentioned, yellow corn and with carbon, I think that's an interesting concept there going forward. That's the biggest crop of them all, especially for corn. 43% goes into ethanol. And each ethanol plant currently does a very basic life cycle assessment, which calculates the carbon intensity of their fuels. But it's, at a macro scale for that CI. Literally it's half is it from the refining process, and the other half is from the fertilizer applied on that farm. But currently now, like ethanol plants, they target corn based on low price. They don't target corn based on their low carbon scorecard. But with this kind of auditing process and traceability, farmers like agronomic practices, smart use of nitrogen, no-till, cover crops, this, and make an effort to reduce their crops. Obviously now they don't get a premium. They get paid the same as like anyone else. With that life cycle assessment auditing that's currently in place, combined with blockchain audit process, now each individual farmer can be assigned their own carbon scorecard. These ethanol plants can target corn not only based on a low price, they can target corn based on a low CI, their low carbon intensity number, because when they sell the DDGs or the ethanol back into the market, they'll get a premium if that's been kind of verified. That's something exciting for the biggest crop of all, where this kind of traceability has potential there going forward.
Yeah, and we've talked about farmers are in the business of producing, but they also sequester a lot of carbon in their soils. Right now, we can't trace that. We can't prove that. We can't do anything with it. But the first step to it is, like you say, that traceability there and that proving of, yes, we are actually sequestering carbon in our soils there. And that should make this product worth more than it is for my neighbor who's not.
We think that, this kind of distributed ledger technology, it's just the highway, that data flow up and down. And it's been audited. So it could be kind of anything, really. But as I said, the low-hanging fruit is just capturing what's currently recorded. And then you can, look to incorporate newer data sets.
Yeah, if somebody says, I'll pay for that, you know what? If you'll pay for it, I'll record
sign
it.
me up. Yeah, sign me up.
Absolutely.
Sure. Yep.
So how did you get started in this? What drives you into this type of an industry and makes it such a passion for you?
Most people in agriculture, they're kind of brought up on a farm, as I was in Australia, from a geographic location, if you're familiar. It's kind of like 5 hours kind of northwest of Melbourne. Very different country than Ontario.
I'm sure.
Sandy, loam, 12-inch kind of rainfall country, and it's all cropping. Used to be a lot of sheep before the market fell out back in the early 90s. So I was fifth generation on the farm. We had cropping. We had actually had extensive cattle and sheep operations and cattle and also like camels as well. We had a mob of 30 odd camels on our property. And so, yeah, I was involved in that from growing up. But as most kind of farm kids especially in an isolated region where we were, you just wanted to get the hell out of the farm completely. And so it was nothing that I was very interested to pursue as I was growing up. I was more attracted to the bright lights of the city where you can see people and so forth. And so actually I studied like architecture for 2 years for my first 2 years at university. But then I transferred into, actually I read a great book, which is pretty famous. It's Dan Morgan, Merchants of Grain. It was published in the 70s. And it kind of highlighted back then, that was, the famous Russian grain robbery and how the Soviets under the nose of the Americans kind of basically brought the US crop a couple of times over. And it detailed that and then more of the history of the grain trade. I found it interesting and then transferred into ag. And the past 18 years, I've been in the grains supply chain, working from grower accumulations in the labs during school holidays, loading bulk vessels at the terminal, to logistics, trade finance, exports, trading. Yeah, my last job before Grain Discovery, I was at the Canada Pension Plan. So I did my part for the pension fund. Yes, I've always been in grain from a background, and sometimes we hate it, sometimes we love it, but that's the industry we chose. But as I said, I think it's an exciting time. Ag's the least digitized sector there is. But it's funny, like we think about, at the same time, ag is very high tech. Think about corn yield tripling over the past 30 years. Think about all the technology in tractors and combines. We've had self-driving tractors for 20 years. But in one aspect, as I talked about, the contract execution, that paper trail, it's still pretty much old school. So there was a tremendous opportunity, I think, in the industry to look at that kind of now.
So if people want to find out more about Grain Discovery, where do they go?
graindiscovery.com, or you can just shoot me an email direct, Rory, R-O-R-Y, at graindiscovery.com. And we're always looking for partners. And blockchain is a very collaborative industry. And with more partners involved, the rising tide analogy, yeah? So we're always looking for like innovative partners that want to kind of pilot this technology and so forth. So definitely reach out. Yeah, I'm based here in Picton in Prince Edward County. One of the benefits of COVID, you can now work anywhere. We're proud to be an Ontario company. We're doing some interesting and world first stuff right here in this great province.
I'm looking forward to seeing where this all goes 10 years and 20 years down the road to see where that traceability and where this technology ends up. Join us next time when we'll be talking to Brian Gilvesi of the agricultural charity Alice. Alice is a charity that is dedicated to helping farmers and ranchers build nature-based solutions on their land to help sustain agriculture and biodiversity for the benefit of our communities and for future generations. That's next time on The Back 40. Rory, thank you very much for being part of The Back 40 today.
Look forward to it, Mike. Thanks for the conversation.
You've been listening to The Back 40. Brought to you by Trillium Mutual Insurance. Be sure to subscribe to The Back 40 wherever you find your favorite podcasts so that you don't miss an episode. The Back 40, bringing the ag community together one podcast at a time. I'm Mike Brine. Until next time, take care and stay safe.